There was a 13th disciple, and the church erased him from history because he understood what Jesus actually taught, and that truth would have destroyed everything they built in his name. This isn't conspiracy, this is documented suppression, fragments of testimonies scattered across deserts and hidden in jars, because someone knew that what was being constructed in Rome wasn't what happened in Galilee. And the difference between those two realities is the difference between liberation and control, between awakening and obedience, between the living Christ and the dead institution. The forbidden disciple wasn't forbidden because he was evil. He was forbidden because he was right. And his presence in the story reveals that Jesus wasn't teaching religion. He was teaching revolution of consciousness, a complete inversion of power, identity, and the nature of divinity itself. And they couldn't let that story survive because empires cannot be built on the teaching that God is already inside you, that you don't need priests or temples or intermediaries, that the kingdom is here, now, within, accessible to the beggar and the prostitute and the tax collector, without permission from any human authority. The name you've been taught to fear is Judas, but that's only because they needed a villain, a scapegoat, someone to absorb the shame and betrayal so the rest of the narrative could be sanitized. So Peter could be forgiven for denying Christ 3 times while Judas hangs from a tree for doing exactly what the divine plan required. Think about that for a moment. Truly sit with the theological violence of it. If Jesus came to die, if the crucifixion was necessary for salvation, then whoever delivered him to that fate was performing the most sacred act in human history, the hinge upon which all redemption turns. And yet we curse his name. We make him the ultimate traitor. We teach children that his kiss was evil, when it was the kiss that saved the world according to the very logic of Christian doctrine. This contradiction isn't accidental. It's structural. It's the crack in the foundation that reveals the entire building was constructed backwards, that something essential was inverted, that the story you inherited has been turned inside out to serve purposes Jesus himself would have condemned. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the Egyptian desert in the 1970s and carbon dated to around 280 CE, but likely composed in the 2nd century, contains teachings so threatening to Orthodox Christianity that scholars spent decades debating whether to even translate it fully. And what it reveals is this: Judas didn't betray Jesus. He was the only one who understood him, the only disciple who grasped that Christ wasn't here to establish a new religion, but to annihilate the very concept of religion as separation from the divine. And Jesus specifically chose Judas to complete the mission, because Judas alone could bear the weight of being hated for doing what love required. In the canonical Gospels, we see Judas through a lens of contempt, the greedy treasurer who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. But even in those texts, the cracks show through because Matthew tells us Judas was filled with remorse and returned the money, and the chief priests wouldn't take it back because it was blood money, which means Judas had a conscience, which means his action wasn't simple greed or malice, which means the story is more complex than we've been told. And when you read the Gospel of Judas, you discover Jesus laughing at the other disciples when they pray, because they're praying to the wrong God. They're worshiping the creator of this material world, the demiurge, the false god who traps souls in flesh and calls it life. And only Judas recognizes that Jesus is teaching gnosis, direct knowledge of the true God beyond this universe, the God who is pure light and consciousness, and who has nothing to do with the blood sacrifices and temple rituals and priestly hierarchies that defined Judaism and would soon define Christianity. Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. You will release me from this prison of flesh. You alone understand that I am not this body, that salvation isn't about believing the right things, but about awakening to what you truly are beneath the costume of personality and history and religious identity." This is Gnostic Christianity, the original heresy, the teaching that predates the councils and creeds, and it was systematically destroyed because it made institutional religion obsolete. Because if every person has direct access to God through inner awakening, then you don't need bishops or popes or anyone to tell you what to believe, and empires cannot be built on that foundation. So they built on Peter instead. Peter who misunderstood, Peter who denied, Peter the rock upon which a church of stone could stand, while Judas the true disciple was erased, rewritten, transformed from enlightened initiate into eternal villain. But here's what they couldn't completely erase: the kiss. Even in the official version, Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss, and kisses in that culture were signs of devotion, of love, of intimate recognition, and the fact that this is how he marks Jesus for arrest tells you something survived the editing, something the censors couldn't quite remove because it was too central to the story's architecture. The kiss is the seal of gnosis, the transmission of secret knowledge, and in mystical traditions across the world, the kiss between teacher and disciple represents the moment of awakening. The breath of God passed from one mouth to another. And what if that's what happened in Gethsemane? What if in that moment Judas was performing the final initiation, the confirmation that Jesus was ready to complete the great work, to die consciously, to show that death has no power over the awakened soul? And his kiss wasn't betrayal but blessing, not identification for the guards but recognition for the cosmos. The moment when the disciple affirms the Master's readiness for transformation. The church turned this inside out because they needed Jesus to be a victim. They needed the crucifixion to be about suffering and sin and debt paid to an angry God. But the Gnostic reading is that Jesus went to the cross in full knowledge and power, that he wasn't sacrificed but transformed, that the resurrection wasn't God raising a dead man, but consciousness demonstrating its independence from matter. And Judas was the witness, the initiate, the one who held space for that demonstration by doing what appeared to be evil, but was actually the most profound act of love. Releasing the teacher from the final attachment, which is the attachment to being understood, to being loved, to being remembered well. You can feel why they burned these texts, why they buried them, why for 1700 years anyone caught reading the Gospel of Judas could be tortured and executed. Because this version of the story doesn't need the church, doesn't need the sacraments, doesn't need you to feel guilty and small and dependent on priests to intercede with an angry God on your behalf. This version says you are already divine, already free, already whole, and suffering is just forgetting that truth. And Jesus came not to die for your sins, but to show you that death itself is an illusion, a costume change, a doorway rather than an ending, and the only sin is remaining asleep when you could be awake, remaining in the prison of false identity when the door has always been open. That's not a message you can build a Vatican on. That's not a teaching you can use to control populations and collect tithes and wage holy wars. So they rewrote it. They made it about belief instead of knowing, about faith instead of experience, about Jesus dying instead of Jesus demonstrating. And they needed a villain to make that narrative work. So Judas became the ultimate scapegoat, the one who carries all the shadows so the institution can pretend to be light. But if you read the earliest Christian texts, before the councils decided what was heresy and what was orthodoxy, you find a much stranger, wilder, more mystical Jesus, a teacher who spoke in riddles and paradoxes, who said the kingdom of heaven is within you and also among you, who told people to be passers-by in this world, to not store up treasures on earth, to give away everything and follow him into a way of being that had nothing to do with religion as we understand it, and everything to do with waking up from the dream of separation. The Gospel of Thomas, another text excluded from the Bible, records Jesus saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. And if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." That's not Christianity as we know it. That's not about believing Jesus died for your sins. That's about the inner work of self-realization, the process of bringing the unconscious to consciousness, of integrating the shadow, of becoming whole. And it aligns perfectly with what the Gospel of Judas suggests, that Jesus was teaching psychological and spiritual transformation, that he was a wisdom teacher in the lineage of the Buddha and Lao Tzu, not the founder of a religion, but a destroyer of religious thinking. And the disciples who understood this were written out of history, while the ones who misunderstood became the foundation of the church, because misunderstanding can be controlled, can be codified, can be turned into doctrine and dogma and institutional power. The tragedy isn't that Judas betrayed Jesus. The tragedy is that we betrayed Judas. We made him carry the weight of our own shadow, our own capacity for necessary harm, for difficult love, for the actions that look like evil but are actually evolution. Every spiritual tradition has this figure, the dark initiate, the one who pushes the hero into transformation by appearing to be the enemy. In alchemy, it's the nigredo, the blackening, the death that precedes rebirth. In Buddhism, it's Mara, the tempter who tests the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. In the Greek mysteries, it's the descent into the underworld that every initiate must make. And in the Jesus story, it's Judas, the one who appears to destroy but actually fulfills, the one who looks like betrayer but is actually the guardian of the threshold, the psychopomp who guides the soul through the death that isn't death into the life that is eternal. We needed him to be evil because we needed the story to be simple, needed it to be about good guys and bad guys, about us versus them, about the saved and the damned. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. It's about the part of you that has to die so the real you can be born. It's about the ego that must be sacrificed so consciousness can be free. And Judas represents that function, that necessity, that terrible love that looks like hate, but is actually the deepest service. And here's where it gets even stranger. Some scholars argue that Judas wasn't even a person, that he's a literary figure representing the Jewish people, that the name Judas is related to Judea, to Judaism itself, and the story of his betrayal is actually early Christian anti-Semitism encoded into Scripture, the church blaming the Jews for killing Jesus by personifying them as the betrayer disciple. And if that's true, then for 2,000 years we've been condemning an entire people based on a character assassination written into the founding texts of Christianity, which would make the lie about Judas not just a theological error, but a genocidal one, the root of the pogroms and the blood libels and ultimately the Holocaust, all branching from this single narrative choice to make the disciple with the Jewish name the villain of the story. That possibility should shake you, should make you question every received narrative, should make you ask what other lies we've inherited and called holy, what other violence we've justified with stories we never examined, and whether the Jesus who actually lived would recognize anything of himself in the religion that bears his name, or whether he would weep at what was done with his teaching, how it was inverted and weaponized and turned into exactly the kind of power structure he spent his life opposing. The forbidden disciple is forbidden because he represents forbidden knowledge, the gnosis that can't be controlled, the direct experience of the divine that makes mediators obsolete. And every empire that has ever tried to own God has had to suppress this knowledge because it's the knowledge that ends empires, that dissolves hierarchies, that reveals the emperor has no clothes and never did, that power is always a lie told by the fearful to the faithful, and truth is always simple and always free, and always available to anyone who stops believing and starts looking. Jesus taught that looking, that inner gaze, that turning of attention away from external authorities and toward the still small voice within. And some people understood and most people didn't. And the ones who didn't built churches, and the ones who did were burned as heretics. And Judas stands at that fork in the road, the disciple who went all the way, who understood that following Jesus meant becoming Jesus, meant dying to the false self and being reborn as consciousness itself. And his kiss in the garden was the seal on that understanding, the confirmation that the work was complete, that the teacher could now demonstrate the final teaching, which is that death is a doorway, and suffering is optional, and God is not outside you judging you, but inside you being you. And once you know that, really know it, not believe it but know it, then you're free, absolutely free. And no institution can hold you, no doctrine can bind you, no authority can tell you who you are or what you're worth or whether you're saved or damned, because those categories collapse in the light of direct knowing. This is why the Gospel of Judas was buried in a jar in the Egyptian desert, why it had to be hidden for the people who would come later, the ones who would be ready to hear it, who would have enough distance from the institution to see through the lies, who would be living in a time when the church's power was waning, and the old stories could finally be questioned. And maybe that time is now. Maybe we're the ones who were meant to find these texts, to read them with new eyes, to understand that Christianity as we inherited it is a Roman political construct, a fusion of Jewish messianism with Greek philosophy and Roman organizational structure. And somewhere in that fusion the original teaching was lost, was inverted, was turned from liberation into bondage, from awakening into obedience, from the radical equality of divine consciousness into the strict hierarchies of religious authority. The forbidden disciple is the thread that, when pulled, unravels the whole garment, reveals that it was always stitched together from pieces that don't quite match, that there's another story underneath, a truer story, a story about human awakening rather than divine judgment, about consciousness exploring itself through the drama of separation and return, about love so complete it includes what looks like betrayal, about sacrifice so profound it requires someone to be willing to be hated forever for doing what needed to be done. And maybe that's the real teaching, the one so forbidden it had to be encoded in the figure of the betrayer, that sometimes love requires you to be the villain in someone else's story, that sometimes the deepest service is the one that will never be recognized, that sometimes you have to be willing to be misunderstood completely, to be condemned, to be erased from the narrative of the good and beautiful and true, because what's required isn't your reputation but your action, isn't your vindication but your function, and Judas performed that function, carried that weight, accepted that fate, and the fact that we still curse his name 2,000 years later is proof that he succeeded, that the sacrifice was complete, that he gave not just his life but his eternal reputation, his place in human memory, his hope of ever being understood. And that's a deeper sacrifice than dying on a cross. That's a sacrifice that extends through all of time, that echoes in every passion play, and a Sunday school lesson and work of art that depicts him as the betrayer. And all of it, all of that hatred and condemnation and scapegoating, he took it willingly so the story could continue, so the seed could be planted, so the teaching could survive even in inverted form, waiting for the day when someone would ask the right questions, would see the contradictions, would find the buried texts and read the forbidden Gospels, and understand that everything we were told was backwards, that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, that the condemned disciple was the faithful one, and the faithful disciples were the ones who condemned him. And in that reversal, in that unbearable irony, the teaching is preserved, the truth survives, the light continues to shine even from inside the darkness where we tried to bury it. And Judas, the forbidden disciple, the scapegoat, the shadow-bearer, the one who loved enough to be hated, remains the secret key to understanding what Jesus actually taught, which is that you are not who you think you are, that God is not who you think God is, that salvation is not what you think it is, and the only way to know truth is to be willing to have everything you believe be wrong, to die to your identity, to kiss the teacher goodbye and watch him transform, to be branded a traitor for serving a truth too large for the small minds who write history, and to trust that someday someone will understand, will see through the lie to the love beneath it, will recognize that the greatest act of faith is sometimes to do the thing that destroys faith itself, because faith is belief, and belief is just thought, and thought is the veil that must be torn so that knowing can emerge, direct and unmediated and absolutely free. And that knowing is what Judas had, what Jesus gave him, what they shared in that kiss, what we lost when we made the story simple, what we can reclaim if we're brave enough to see the forbidden disciple not as villain but as hero, not as betrayer but as beloved, not as the one who destroyed the Christ but as the one who set him free.